Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Daring YA Debuts from Zando Young Readers. I'm Sarah Hunter, Books for Youth and Graphic Novels Editor at Booklist. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. Today's slide presentation was included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download it, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on the link located there. You can also download the slides by typing the URL on this screen into your web browser. If you have any trouble, please contact us at webinars@booklistonline.com. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions, and we'll pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you after the webinar. Booklist offers closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for and click the live transcript icon on the toolbar mentioned earlier. From there, you can select Show or Hide Subtitles from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting Caption Settings. And finally, Booklist expects all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates this standard of behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, may, at the discretion of the organizers, be immediately removed. We have a wonderful conversation planned for today, so without further ado, let's meet our panelists and learn a little bit about their new books. We'll kick things off with Madeline Claire Franklin. Madeline is a graduate of the Vermont College of Fine Arts MFA program in writing for children and young adults. When she is not writing strange fiction for young adults, she is probably attempting to dismantle white supremacy and/or practicing witchcraft. She is queer, Jewish, and visibly disabled woman living in sin in Buffalo, New York, with her partner, 2 dogs, 3 cats, and 2 Roombas in a little yellow house called Cluckleberry Farms. Thanks for being here, Madeline. Tell us a little bit about the Wilderness of Girls.
Hi, and thank you so much, Booklist, for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my debut novel. The Wilderness of Girls is about a troubled teen named Ree who discovers 4 feral girls living in the wilderness of upstate New York and gets caught up in the ensuing mystery of who the girls really are. The world believes they are brainwashed kidnapping victims, but the girls believe they are princesses from another world. As the mystery deepens, the secrets of Ree's own past begin to reveal themselves, until at last Ree will have to make a choice that will change her life and the lives of the wild girls forever. This book is also about what it means to be raised and socialized female in Western civilization, and the many tiny boxes girls and women tend to be squeezed into. It's about finding the place and people you belong with, but also about reclaiming identity and individuality after complex trauma. On a lighter note, it's also about the fine lines between magic and the mundane, perception and belief. The main character, Ree, wants to believe in magic when she meets the wild girls, and she wants to believe in their faraway world of Lutheria. Readers, too, will desperately want the wild girl story to be true, and I think that speaks to something deep and possibly universal in the human heart, that we crave magic and wonder and mystery. But this craving, when used as an escape from reality, can also be dangerous. It can cross lines into cultism and avoidance. In the end, this book is about accepting the things you have been through and learning to deal with the many gray and ambiguous parts of life, both through individual strength and through the bonds of a strong support network. And that's it for now, but I look forward to talking a little bit more about it later.
Thanks so much, Madeline. Now we'll be joined by Wen-yi Lee. Wen is a Clarion West alum from Singapore who likes writing about girls with bite, feral nature, and ghosts. Her speculative fiction has appeared in venues such as Lightspeed, Strange Horizons, and Uncanny, as well as in various anthologies. The Dark We Know is her debut novel. Find her on social media at Wen-yi Lee and otherwise at wenyileewrites.com. Welcome, Wen. Tell us about The Dark We Know.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so The Dark We Know is my debut novel. It is a queer YA horror inspired by Spring Awakening, and it is about a bisexual Chinese American art student called Isa, who ran away from her haunted small town 2 years ago after the death of her friends. But now she's forced to return for her abusive father's funeral. And upon coming back, she has to reunite not only with her estranged mother and sister, but also the last surviving childhood friend she left behind. And this friend insists that he can see ghosts and that the thing that was responsible for their friend's death is still haunting the town, and that Isa is the key to stopping it from killing more kids. Um, so it's really a book, I think, about homecomings. It's a book about loss and grief, and mental health, about repression and shame and family and yearning for innocence, and how the things and the people that we've known sort of continue to echo through us in good and bad ways. It's about generational hauntings and breaking cycles. But I think ultimately it is about healing and learning to let go and finding strength in connection, and how there are things that sort of get better with the turning seasons. It is a horror, and there is a haunting, and there are terrible things that happen to these characters who are in quite terrible places. But I've always been the kind of writer that writes towards hope. And I think that's very much what this is. And yeah, like Madeline said, I'm looking forward to talking more about it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Our final presentation will come from Trisha Tobias. Trisha is an associate developmental editor at YA book packager Dovetail Fiction, a Highlights Foundation Diversity Fellow, and a Walter Dean Myers Grant recipient. Previously, she was an editor of Foreshadow, a serial YA anthology. She holds a BA in Media and Communication Studies with a minor in creative writing from Fordham University. In her downtime, Trisha can be found vibing to K-pop, shuffling tarot cards, and tweaking her skincare routine yet again. Trisha lives in Morganton, North Carolina, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Trish Tobias. Honeysuckle and Bone is her debut novel. Thank you for being here, Trisha. Tell us about your book.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I am the author of Honeysuckle and Bone, and Honeysuckle and Bone follows the story of Karina, a Jamaican-American teen who becomes an au pair in Jamaica in hopes of escaping her own past and getting this fresh start that she desperately needs. And everything seems really perfect at first. She's working for this powerful political family. She's living and working at this luxurious cliffside estate, and her new coworkers are quickly becoming her closest friends. But her lucky break turns out not to be quite so lucky, because at night, something is terrorizing Karina. But is it the house? Is it the staff? Or maybe her past has finally caught up with her in the worst possible way. Honeysuckle and Bone is gothic horror meets coming of age with a Caribbean twist, and it touches on quite a lot, including themes of identity and shame, redemption, and really owning the choices that we make without allowing them to completely define us. And I'm really happy to talk about it with you all today.
Wonderful. I'd like to invite all of you to turn your cameras on, and I will too, and we can start talking more about all of our books, or your books. I haven't written a book. So my first question is, what started you on your path to writing, both generally and your aspirations of being an author, and for this book in particular? Madeline, how about we start with you on this one? That's okay?
Sure. Yeah, I've actually been writing longer than I can remember. I started with, I guess it would have been considered fan fiction, although I don't know if that word existed at the time. I just called it plagiarism of The Last Unicorn when I was in like kindergarten. And from there, it just sort of grew. I was fortunate to do a lot of creative writing in school as part of the curriculum. And in 5th grade, I got like the biggest ego boost from my English teacher, because she picked my short story to read to all of her English classes as an example of what to do. And from there, it was really, I knew I was good with words. I was a huge reader. I enjoyed expressing myself through words. But this is kind of a weird one. I was obsessed with the Star Wars movies as a kid, the original trilogy. And I started reading the novels that come, like the extended universe novels, and I was really blown away by what you could do with words versus film. And I love film, don't get me wrong, but the words go so much deeper. And these aren't like breathtaking stories by any means. They're not bad either. I'm just saying they're not going to win like a Nobel Prize. But I was so blown away by the depth of character and emotion and the resonance that you could experience on the page. And I wanted to do that myself. I loved stories, but it was in that moment when I was reading those books that I realized that's how I wanted to tell my stories. I did actually go on to get a degree in film, but I didn't use it very much. And so for The Wilderness of Girls, I have been writing for a long time, lots of drawer novels and all that. I actually started this almost a decade ago, a little bit less. It was right after my divorce, and I was going through a lot, and I was realizing how I had played a role in my own unhappiness because I had been trying to play a role that wasn't me. And even as a person who has always been sort of anti-authority and like going against the mainstream, I somehow found myself still playing a part of wife and woman and girl, and it just wasn't me. And I it was really breathtaking in a bad way to realize that I didn't really know who I was in a lot of ways. And I could pinpoint it. It started in childhood, and it was how I was raised. And even my own mother, very feminist, very not mainstream, somehow also fell into it. It's like no matter, she tried to break that with me, but she couldn't be completely successful. And I really did write this book because I feel like if the younger you can be to become aware of this, of how you are being influenced by the culture that you are in to play a certain role, especially women. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, it's a cat. The healthier you will be as an adult, the stronger you will be in your identity. And it's, it's still something that I work on even now. It's probably going to be a lifelong unlearning, but I really felt like this was a story that I wanted to tell to help younger me and hopefully other young people as well. And according to the reviews, I've helped a lot of adult women. So
Wen-yi, that reminds me a lot of the themes in your book too. Did you have a similar kind of inspiration for your novel?
In a way, yeah, I feel like that's very hard to follow up, Madeline. So great start. I would love to see your cat. But while we're here, yeah, I mean, I think in a very similar way, actually, really similar. I was also the kid that like have been writing my whole life. Started out big reader, big writer, um, Star Wars fanfic. So really similar in that way. I think a lot of us started in the same way. I was big on like Wattpad. I was big in like fanfic for a while, and then like progress to like my own stories. Um, so yeah, I've sort of been doing that my whole life. But I think the point where I started to really take it seriously and start thinking about, actually revising and putting a book together, and figuring out who I wanted to be as a writer, and then also like actively trying to get published was very much, I think, firstly sort of encountering more like sort of Asian fiction and Asian authors in the past, like, 5 years. Growing up, I didn't really have that. And then sort of encountering that as a sort of late teens, I was in college, and starting to find all these authors, Fonda Lee, R.F. Kuang, Zen Cho, Niveau. I was like, oh, that started to help shape what I wanted to write and what I felt like my voice was and how I could write speculative fiction in a way that felt authentic to me. Um, and so it was that, and then the pandemic hit, And I think like a lot of other people, I just had nothing better to do. So I was like, I might as well try and sit down and get this book finished, and commit to something that I sort of put off for a while because I was just so busy. You know, as horrible as it sounds, I think I really have to credit COVID with helping me like reconnect with writing because it just led me back to something that had sort of been a fallback for me and like a comfort and an expression for me my whole life. And you know, because I was in such a point of it was I had just graduated and I had to go back home you know, earlier than expected. I had left all my friends. I was unemployed. I had literally nothing to do but like stay at home. I was in quite a bad place. And so The Dog We Know was just one of those books that came out of me very quickly. It was something that I had to write for myself, and that came from a very natural and necessary place. I've never written anything that fast ever again, and I probably never will. But yeah, I think it very much came from that place of wanting connection and grappling with the sense of coming home, and sort of working through my own, I think, mental state at the time. Yeah, so I think in a similar way to Madeline, it was a book that came from a place of needing to work something out and reconcile something for myself. And yeah, I think I got there. And hopefully, I think it's for, you know, me at the time, it's for teenage me, and hopefully it reaches other people in that place as well.
Great. Tell us about your path to writing.
Um, it's so funny, the similarities between what I was gonna say and what everyone else has said. Like, avid reader as a child, it annoyed my parents a lot. I understand. Couldn't keep books in the house. And I don't know exactly when my interest in reading turned into an interest in writing. It feels like it just sort of happened, but I think it was somewhere around middle school, junior high, when I discovered and it participated in National Novel Writing Month for the first time. I discovered fan fiction, got very into that. Kingdom Hearts fan fiction was my thing. And also I started to like get really into word choice specifically. I got hyper fixated on that. And so I would take like my English assignments that were, you know, vocab homework, you know, use this word in a sentence. I would take all of the vocab words and then put them all in like a 10-page Comic Sans short story. That was not the assignment, but that was how I was spending my time. And I think it was just me realizing then that even though I was super shy and I was very quiet, I actually did have quite a lot to say. And maybe writing was one way where I could share what I had to say and explore that in a way that felt safe or controlled, or like it was mine and nobody really could judge me unless I shared it and I didn't have to. With Honeysuckle and Bone specifically, I started developing that idea as part of my editorial job, and the idea for it came up about a year after my father passed away, and I was feeling very lost and unsure. And part of how I think I was trying to ground myself is I was leaning on my mother more, and that meant we were talking a lot more. I was asking her a lot of questions about herself and her life and her past, and that meant I get to hear all of the stories of her childhood in Jamaica, things she had told me as a kid, but they sound different and kind of more interesting as an adult time. And that also led to hearing those like Duppy stories, those ghost stories again, which again, it felt different hearing them in my adulthood because now I had actually lost somebody. And so the prospect of someone's spirit remaining and them still being around, and my mother kind of was moving through her grief in that way of kind of acting like dad is still in the apartment, causing problems, being annoying. And watching her move through that, you put all of that together, plus, you know, the grief I was feeling at the time still, and my own thoughts about like the past and regrets and things you don't get to say because you don't realize you've run out of time to say it. And it turned into an idea of like a ghost story set in Jamaica. And I think the idea was originally, develop this idea and find someone else to write it and bring it to life. But I think I kind of played myself and developed something that I really needed to write for me. So like everyone else said, it's like I was processing something.
Oh, so you've talked a lot about home and you've talked a lot about ghosts. And I sent you questions ahead of time, and there's a question about home and a question about ghosts, but I kind of feel like they might be the same question. Do you think they're the same question? You're all writing about home. Some of you are explicitly writing about ghosts. I'm curious about what makes homecoming or leaving home or finding home such a prominent theme for teen readers. And then, sort of like attendant to that, seemingly unrelated, but I think actually related. Are ghosts real? Is my follow-up question. um, Wen-yi, can we start with you? Let's talk about home first, and then let's talk about ghosts.
Yeah. Um, I think, yeah, it's interesting how we all sort of overlapped in specific ways. But yeah, I think home as a theme and sort of, attendant to that, family as a theme, and also I think, Gothic traditions that I sort of tend to draw on, that Trisha obviously draws on. Um, I think home is so resonant. Um, Obviously because it's it's the place where you grow up. It's sort of symbolic of everything that's made you, of this environment that you've grown up in that either contains you or nurtures you, and I think that friction is really interesting to explore. I think it's so resonant for teens, especially in terms of homecoming, or in terms of teens going through this coming of age, because both of those things I think are really about you changing as a person, and you've changed as a person, you are trying to assert yourself. And then you're coming back to this very familiar place, this very um, intrinsic and like rooted place almost. And the question is sort of, is it hostile to you changing, or is it, embracing? Is it a safe place for you, or is it this cage? And I think that's always what this tension is. It can be, a place that grows you or a place that traps you. And it can be both at the same time, and the people in it can be both at the same time. And I think when I think about change and I think about homecoming and I think about ghosts, I think where that all overlaps for me is the sense that, especially when you come back, um, after you've been away for some time, when you come home, there's sort of a weird, I think, almost liminal return to like a childhood state. And the person that you were growing up there, or living there previously. And it's always like the echoes of a past you in these hallways, in these rooms, on this bed, in these chairs. And I think that's a haunting in a way. It's a haunting of your past self. And that can be good or that can be bad, depending on the kind of story that we're telling. But I think that's where it overlaps for me, and that's what I think a lot about, it's the memories that are in this place. It's the version of you in the relationships. So I think that resonates a lot with teens because they are trying to really find themselves outside of, their home where they grew up almost. As for whether ghosts are real, um, I don't know if I can answer that question. I want to say like practically in my day-to-day life, I probably don't operate on the assumption that they are real. But I kind of like to believe it. I think it spices up the world if I think they are out there. And also because I live in Singapore, I live in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a very famously like haunted place. There's a lot of ghost stories. Ghost stories are very, my old like school had haunted like places all over. It's very normal. So I always think it's an interesting question, especially when talking to people overseas. Ghosts are very much like part of a fabric of like daily life and the culture here. So I don't operate on this I don't live my life as though they are, but I like to think that they are. And I think I find a lot of resonance with the idea of things lingering. Yeah.
Mm.
Curious to hear what others say.
Yeah. Now, hearing you talk about these like liminal places when you're trying to establish a feeling of home made me think a lot about your book, Madeline, and Ree's sort of like in between space of leaving one home that is like uncomfortable and oppressive and trying to find a place among like many different options in front of her. Can you talk a little bit about how you conceived of home as a theme in your book and why you think it works for teens so much?
Yeah, yeah, like you said, Ree starts out the book in her childhood home. She's quickly moved to her uncle's home when her father is arrested. She didn't have a happy childhood, so part of me would even go so far as to say she never really had a home.
Mm.
But I think home can be a lot of different things. Initially, when I was thinking about this question, I was like, oh, well, home is where you belong, it's where you feel safe. But I think home can also be pretty bad, and still feel like home. And I think that's part of why people stay, especially young people. And unfortunately, there are a lot of teenagers out there who are just now, as they're coming into young adulthood, realizing that they might have some power over their situation, and they might be realizing that their situation is bad, and they might be being faced with a choice of, do I stay, do I go, do I ask for help, do I confront the people at home who are making the situation bad? And there's a really strong power of familiarity, even if it's bad. Sometimes just what is unfamiliar can be even more frightening than the known horrors at home. Um, I I wanted to make Ree's journey to her new home believable, but also um, show it like as an option of, sometimes things work out. Sometimes you're removed from a bad situation and it's actually pretty good. It's not necessarily familiar, and you might not necessarily feel comfortable right away. And it might take you a long time to trust new people. Um, but there are good people out there, and some of them might be your family, some might not be. As far as the wild girls in the book, they have vastly different experiences of being moved into foster care. But ultimately, home for them becomes a choice. They choose to make their home where they choose to make it. I don't want to spoil it. Because that's one of the few ways that they can empower themselves. They are safe. I'll give them that. They're safe in either situation, but there are also ghosts and I think every home situation, whether it's old or new, if it's your old home, my conception of ghosts has always been that ghosts are a memory, whether they're your memory or the memory of somebody who is dead. And they influence a lot of different things, and I think that for the wild girls, there's a literal ghost. Well, not a literal ghost, but there's an actual dead person that haunts them in the sense of their memory. It's the person who raised them was a man named Mother, and he told them that they were princesses from another world and they had a destiny to save their kingdoms. And he made them feel special. He made them believe in themselves and in magic. He honestly offered them a wonderful childhood, except for the fact that it was in the wild and he occasionally wandered off and didn't come back for weeks. And they have to grapple with that, the memory of him and what he told them, because the world they're in now is saying he was crazy. He was trying to brainwash them. He probably kidnapped them from loving families. and the girls have to choose what they believe. Sort of like how they have to choose where they're going to live eventually. I just think that both Home and Ghosts, they do have quite a lot of overlap, because so much of those things are wrapped up in memory and emotion. And I don't know, that I guess that's pretty much the summary there, is both of those things are wrapped up in memory and emotion. And I think that there's just a lot to explore there.
Yeah. Trisha, how about you?
I mean, Home to me, I think it's relevant and important for teen readers because they, especially in their later teen years, you're going through so many intense life transitions, right? And you start out, you have this idea of home that's probably linked to, home is where my family is, home is where my friends are, home is where my favorite diner is, home is where I go to school. And as you get older, so much is changing around you, including how you define something that has felt maybe really like solid up until that point. Like, what is home if your family starts to disperse? What's home if all of your friends are working or going to school in different states or different countries now? What's home when the favorite diner shuts down? And so I think at a time when a lot of teenagers are working on figuring out who they are and where they fit in the universe, like literally and otherwise, the idea of like, what does home mean to me? What does that look like? Is that a place? Is that a person? Is that a feeling? Is really important. As for the question about ghosts, are they real? I do not know. I haven't had any personal experiences where I could say for sure, but like Wen-yi and Madeline have both already said, I think like ghosts as like memories, absolutely, it's just like echoes of what's been, for sure. I think about, for me, home used to be New York, Long Island specifically. And I think about how, yeah, there are absolutely like echoes of past me in that place. And if I were to go back, I'm sure I would feel that, but also that place has changed and so have I. And so it would feel a little weird. It's like a liminal space type of an energy for sure. Like the person who was here is not here now, even though I am physically there.
Ethereal.
Very.
Oh, good. I'm so glad we talked about all of this. Wonderful. So for Trisha and Madeline, names are really powerful in your book. For Trisha, nicknames are really powerful. Being allowed to have a nickname, being given a nickname, and then Madeline, like taking on a name on your own. What drew you to that component of your stories? What makes that important to you? Madeline, I'll start with you on this one, if that's okay.
Okay, so I grew up devouring like fairy tales and folklore, and I honestly couldn't remember where I picked this up, but I know that it's big in lore of the Fae, that, if you know a fairy's true name, that you have power over them. And that's always sort of trickled down into my creative work. I know there's also a lot of like video games and like role-playing games out there. They have the concept of like the true name. But for me, I think that part of that initially got into the story because I was like, oh, I want to have this fairy tale vibe going on, especially with the memoir excerpts from the Wild Girls. But as I was writing it, the conversation in the public eye about trans people and about trans children especially became more and more prevalent. And I had a couple friends change their names, some who identified as trans and some who did not. So they just wanted to change their name because their old name had bad memories attached to it, basically. I've never had strong feelings about my name. I don't want to be called something else, but like people will ask me, do you prefer to be called Madeline or Maddie? And I'm like, I honestly don't care. My family calls me Maddie, but that's not to say that you can't call me Maddie. I don't have guards around it. But my friend, especially, who changed her name when not for gender reasons, just for memory reasons. We had a long conversation about that because I was under the impression, I was like, wouldn't it be more empowering, like more of a big flip off to your past to be like, I claim this name now, it's mine, and the past can't have anything to do with it. And she pointed out that like that's a lot of emotional labor that she could just skip over. Like why put herself through that? The name was never important to her. It represents a lot of bad things. And you can stand there and make a bold statement like that, but the truth is those emotions will just continue to come up. They don't just disappear because you stand there in a Superman pose and say no, you know. So I thought that was really an important thing to communicate about your own identity, that you can sort of choose not necessarily to just say goodbye to the past. Like I specifically do discuss that in the book, that you can't just be like, all right, I'm moving on from the past. That's not how it works. But you don't have to make it harder on yourself by continuing to stay basically in a bad place, wearing a name that feels like all of the bad memories you're carrying around.
A haunting.
Yeah, a haunting. Like the name itself could be a haunting. Yeah. So
Interesting.
I think I did a lot with the Wild Girls names. That was very like fairy tale stuff, and that was fun. But I think the more important story was with Ree, who changes her name from Eden at the beginning of the book. So yeah.
Trish, how about you? Tell us about names in your.
Right. And Honeysuckle and Bone, like you were saying, like lots of nicknames, especially. And like that's mostly drawn from, it's really common in Jamaican culture for everyone to have some sort of a nickname, a pet name, a yard name that they use for each other. And it just has me thinking, like, it's, for me at least, it's like twofold. Like the idea of a name that you choose yourself is like one way of you kind of staking your claim in, this little sliver of the universe. This is mine, and I name it Trisha. And like I think there's so much power in being able to do that and assert yourself. But then in terms of like relationships, the idea that you can decide, this is the kind of relationship that I want to have with another person. This is the kind of connection I want to have with somebody else. And so because of that, I'm giving you permission to call me this certain kind of name that's just between us or just between this group. And that identifies us as a team, or we're friends, or we're chosen family. There's a lot of power and a lot of vulnerability in that. And also a lot of power that you are giving to another person, right? Which I also think I probably took from, like as Madeline was talking about earlier, I probably took from specifically a Harvest Moon game where if you married a certain character, then they told you their real name. And I thought that was I thought that was so fascinating as a child. So that's the other piece of this, right? Is using names and what you allow someone to call you and what you call someone else to define like what that relationship is. The idea of revoking that kind of access to another person. You're not allowed to call me, Trisha anymore. Stick to Trisha. That's a boundary. That's a wall. It's fascinating kind of what you can do, how you can navigate those connections with different people just from deciding, hey, you're allowed to call me bestie now.
So I'm gonna zoom out a little bit away from books now. A little bit away from books. How does this novel differ from the first thing you ever read or ever wrote? You could go as far back as elementary school if it's pertinent. Wen-yi, what do you think? How's The Dark We Know different than the first thing you ever wrote?
I mean, I never go that far back because I think the first things I wrote were like fairy stories because I was writing them when I was like 5 years old. So I don't think those really count. And then if you go like a little bit further, it's like Star Wars fan fiction. So I would say it's very different. But I think, I've always been figuring out like where I'm starting in this whole journey because I think, like we all said, when you start that early, there's no like one starting point. You're just continuously like
Mhm.
developing and growing as a writer and figuring out what you're writing about in the first place. But I think I guess the biggest answer for me is that I started writing about non-white people. In all those stories that like I was writing as a kid, as a teenager, it was all like racially ambiguous or like outright like white people. And it's very interesting because I live in an Asian country. I don't live in the West. But just by nature of the books and the movies that I was consuming, that was sort of my standard model for what like a story looks like and what main characters look like. So I think that, the past couple of years and with this book, it was really sort of the first time that I was explicitly starting to write Asian characters and Chinese characters and also queer characters. And so I think that sort of assertion and that like sense of I'm writing my own voice and I'm writing from my own place is definitely something that this book marks. Yeah.
Cool. Trisha, how about you?
I hadn't thought about it, but I did the same thing. I used to write about white or white coded characters quite a lot, and it didn't even register that I used to do that. That's what was in front of you, and so that's what you were emulating. That's wild. Thank you for letting me
Now you
process
can go
that
back
with
and
you.
reflect on it. Yeah.
I'm like, I will talk about that later. And like same if I think about like the very first stories I ever wrote, they were like the big test, like very pulled from what was going on in my, kindergarten life. But I'm thinking about like when I first maybe started to get a little bit more serious about wanting to write and be published at some point. I'd say the biggest difference is probably that I'm more honest now. And by that, I mean, early on, I was really focused on the craft piece of things. And so like I wanted like the sentences needed to be like A plus, like the structure of it needed to be exactly right. I was really focused on that. And I was a little afraid to put any sort of vulnerability and version of myself in the work. One, because for some reason, I think I assumed it was like wildly unprofessional to do that. But on another level, I think there was this fear that if I were to be honest and therefore be vulnerable and then let myself be witnessed and seen, I am setting myself up to eventually be judged and misunderstood by other people. And earlier on in my journey, I definitely was not prepared to deal with that. That was just terrifying to think about. But when I wasn't allowing myself to be vulnerable in the work, it was creating a lot of really technically sound prose that had just no soul in it. And that ended up being the detriment of the work. And so when you're thinking about improving your craft and getting better, a lot of times you're thinking about on the line level. You're not thinking about like, I need to be a person. I need to be a human and write this so that this actually resonates with people outside of just, maybe entertaining them with like a really pretty sentence.
Madeline, how about you? I see a lot of nodding coming from you.
Yeah. Again, if I skip over like all the fan fiction I wrote or things I told myself weren't fan fiction, but definitely were. My first novels were very, like Trisha said, technically excellent, but emotionally kind of void or melodramatic. Like that was the only emotion I could tap into. It was like I think the first novel I finished that was a completely original idea was I look back on it and cringe so hard because I queried that novel And I had some agents bite on it, and I'm so glad that nobody actually picked it up. It was so over the top melodramatic and like, whew. But I was completely out of touch with my emotions. I'm like a late identified autistic, and I have been shoving my emotions down my entire life. And the first novel I wrote that was any good was after I started therapy. So like the best thing I ever did for my writing was go to therapy. Because Trisha's exactly right. If you can't, and there was definitely a vibe of like, don't put yourself in your novels, especially if you're a woman for some reason.
Mm.
Because then it's like a Mary Sue and nobody likes that. But everybody likes that. People love a memoir and they love like a fictional autobiography. Like they like a autobiographically inspired story. Um, the more authentic you can be in your work, the more powerful it is. And that's exactly what I've found with my writing. As I've become more honest on the page and put more of my like deep thoughts and feelings and emotions onto the page, the more other people resonate with that. And it's really scary. I keep a blog very badly. But like every few years I post something and I'm like, why am I bothering to post this? It's just sort of like me talking about stuff. It's not really, it's not craft. It's not like, I don't know. I'm not a teacher yet. But I'll always get somebody, at least a handful of people being like, "Oh, yes, I've been going through something similar, or I recently went through something similar. And I'm so glad you wrote about this because it helped me." And I was like, "Wow." Like, look at that. If we share stuff that we're going through, almost always we're not alone.
Mhm.
And everything that I put into this book, the main thing I took away was that, oh, I am not alone. Like, look at all the people who have read this and the way that they responded. Like, I am not alone. And that's been huge. So
Mm. That's a really good note to end on, I think, because we are about out of time for this part of the webinar. Thank you so much for talking with me so generously about your books today. And now we're going to turn it over to the Zando team, and they will tell us about some of their other upcoming titles.
Hello. Thank you, Maddie, Wen, Trisha. It's been such a joy to work on all of their books. They, especially as debut authors, they're so talented. Each of their novels capture that perfect blend of evocative writing and storytelling that lingers long after you finish. So hope everyone here has a chance to read those beautiful stories. And I'm happy to celebrate some of our other titles at Zando. One of them being I Am Okay to Feel by Karamo Brown and Jason Brown, a father and son pair. This is a story that is perfect for anyone looking for a father and son story. When I was a bookseller for 4 years, I often had people asking me like, "Oh, do you have a father and son picture book?" And there was not many, so I think this is a perfect book that fills that gap. There's also resources in the back of the book that really touch on emotions, and including an emotional wheel where you could discuss what frustration looks like, what being scared looks like. And one thing that like really stuck with me with I Am Okay to Feel is a father telling his son, like, it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be angry, but express it, like own your feelings. And it's such a heartfelt book that I loved working on. Next up, we have our Zando middle grade series, the Doomsday Archives. This is a 3-book series. The second book actually comes out next month, which we're really excited for. And this follows a group of 3 kids who stumble upon the Doomsday Archives, which is a room filled with occult relics. And the relics have a power, and wielded in the wrong hands, they have horrible powers and consequences. In the first book, The Wandering Hour, we have the hourglass, which the first person who sees it, time freezes for everyone, and they have 1 hour to survive against a monster that's hunting them. So very fun. Like, I think Zach, Lauren Clark, and Nick Eliopoulos, they are editors in their own right. They really understand the middle grade market, so it's like not too creepy, even though there are beautiful, creepy illustrations that I would comp to like Scariest Stories to Tell in the Dark. It's truly like this screaming man is like the laughing man is one of my favorite illustrations. I think, just I think I would have remembered as a kid. And with book 2, we have the Heartsealer Mask, and this one is mask relic that lures people in with their truest heart's desire. And forthcoming, we have Shadow Glass, which follows kind of online influencer and how it appeals to teens. And we can move to the next slide. And next up, we have our wonderful author, Vanessa Montalban. We published her debut book, which won the Florida State Award. And it's a Miami set story in 2016 and also a 1980s Cuban story. And we're following 3 women navigating magic, murder, and mayhem. It's kind of like a YA practical magic. It's perfect for someone who's looking for that kind of historical setting that you would find in Divine Rivals with like a little bit of magic and really compelling writing. Like you have a murder in the 2016 timeline, and then in the Cuban timeline, you have a girl who is trying to escape her family legacy of utilizing magic for Castro's regime. And then with Vanessa's sophomore novel that comes out in February, which we're so excited for. The cover is stunning. That she's kind of captured some of the magical elements from her first book, but leaned a little bit more into horror here. And here we're following the myth, a Nicaraguan myth of La Segua, who lures men to their demise, the ones that deserve it, which many of them. And it focuses on Ceci, Ceci, her mom is, and with Ceci and her mom, they do not get along at all. And they move to Ceci's mom's small town where Ceci starts to learn about La Segua, and she discovers a wishing well where she tries to figure out, should she use her wishes for vengeance or maybe to uncover the true reason why La Segua wants so much revenge. And, we love a complicated mother story at Zando. We have Throwback, the paperback edition. We love that we repackaged this, and we're so excited to launch this month. We think it perfectly captures that blend of speculative. This is about a teen girl who's thrown way, 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 way back to 1995, where she's forced to interact with the teenage version of her mother. And to help her mother win homecoming. And it also has that kind of subplot of romance where she falls for the perfect guy in the wrong era. So highly recommend for anyone who loves that kind of complicated family dynamic, but also, a speculative and romantic element. And we can go to the next slide. And here we have a title. It's our next picture book, which is coming actually through Hillman Grad Books, which is Lena Waith's imprint. She came to us with the idea of Lorraine Hansberry having a picture book. She was shocked that she didn't have one, and so were we. And we were able to find a lovely writer with Jay Leslie. Jay has brought such a lyrical and vibrant prose to this story. And then we found Lovis Wise, who has worked on beautiful books like Magnolia Flower. And Lovis has really brought their illustrations to this book in a way that, I don't think anyone else could have. This is a spread where she shows how Lorraine is grieving her father, who didn't have the opportunity to see her as she found her voice. When I first read this, it was the kind of story that I thought, this is the exact reason I became an editor. It talks about Blackness, it talks about womanhood, it talks about queerness during a time when it was illegal to be queer, when it was hard and almost impossible to be a Black creative who could thrive and have her work be presented on Broadway. This is just such a love letter to the creative process, to storytelling, to theater. I think it's a great conversational starter for kids and for adults too. It's one book that if like I think everyone should read, and it would be a great story time read as well. And last up, we have recommended reading, which is a cute YA rom-com about a fat queer bookseller who has a big heart and is his town's local matchmaker. And unfortunately, when he tries to matchmake himself, it ends horribly for him. And his crush is like, I am not interested at all. And he also breaks his bookstore's window and loses his job. But luckily, his Uncle Andy comes in and saves the day, and he finds a new bookstore job at the used bookstore in town. And in comes in anti-romantic Luke. And we have a perfect blend of like opposites attract romance. And we also have a very curmudgeon bookseller in Gladys who is constantly calling Bobby Robert when that's not even his name. This is a book that just kind of stole my heart. And as a fat queer kid myself, I really needed something that showed that I deserved love too. I just want to thank you all for coming and listening to us today. I think we're also appreciative of this opportunity, and we hope you enjoy these books and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much to the Zando Young Readers team. We can't wait to dive in. Tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's video recording, slide presentation, and a certificate of completion. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit www.booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones like those you see here. Whether you're traveling overseas, across the country, or via armchair this summer, we have your next beach read. Subscribe now to get print and digital copies of Booklist and digital and shareable issues of our new patron-friendly product, Booklist Reader, for a special webinar price of $99. In addition to these publications, you'll also get archive access, extra online content, and our 2024 Guide to Graphic Novels issue mailing this July. Last July. Head over to the Booklist website for details. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, and a huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for that wonderful conversation, Madeline, Wen, and Trisha, and to our sponsor, Zando Young Readers. This concludes today's webinar. See you next time.